All right, so today we are digging into the Paris Peace Treaties of 1919. These were the agreements that were supposed to guarantee we'd never see a conflict like World War I again. But as we'll see, they kind of did the exact opposite.
So this is the big question, right? How on earth did a treaty meant to end all wars actually help set the stage for an even bigger one just 20 years later? We're going to see how all these incredible, lofty ideals came crashing down into the hard reality of politics, and how that clash shaped the rest of the 20th century.
You have to remember, after World War I, the world was just shattered. Everyone was desperate for a new way forward. And then in walks US President Woodrow Wilson. He shows up in Paris, and he's treated like a global hero, with massive crowds cheering for him. And he brought with him this really bold, really idealistic vision for a whole new kind of peace. He brought this thing called the 14 Points to the table. And for its time, it was totally radical. It wasn't about one country getting the better of another, it was based on morality. It talked about stuff like national self-determination, this idea that people who share a culture and language should get to have their own country. And it called for this groundbreaking new thing, a League of Nations, an international group to make sure a war like this could never happen again. And this quote right here, it just perfectly captures that hope. The idea was a new world order built on justice for everyone, on the rule of law, not on brute force. A world where every single nation, big or small, had a right to exist safely. I mean, can you imagine? After years of the most brutal war in history, this sounded like a dream come true.
Okay, so you have these incredible ideals, but how do you actually make them work in the real world? Well, this is where things start to get messy. The negotiators in Paris tried to put these big ideas into practice, starting with the two biggest ones, creating the League of Nations and redrawing the entire map of Europe.
First up, the League of Nations. I mean, on paper, it's a brilliant idea, right? A global club where countries talk out their problems instead of shooting at each other. The problem was, it was basically a toothless tiger from day one. Wilson's own Congress here in the US refused to join, which was a huge blow. And the League itself had no army, no real power to make aggressive nations actually listen to it.
Then there's this idea of self-determination. They started redrawing the map of Europe, breaking up old empires and trying to give every ethnic group its own country. So you get a new Poland, a new Czechoslovakia. But here's the thing. People don't live in neat little boxes on a map. When they drew these new borders, they ended up trapping millions of people as minorities in these new countries. So instead of creating stability, you've just created a whole new set of resentments and arguments over territory.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. Because these universal principles, turns out, they weren't so universal after all. It all depended on where you lived. Literally, while these guys are in Paris in their fancy suits talking about justice and peace for all, something very, very different is happening halfway across the world inside the British Empire. We're talking April 1919. The place, the city of Amritsar in British-controlled India. So you've got this huge crowd, men, women, kids, peacefully protesting these new British laws that are stripping away their basic civil rights. Then, British troops show up, led by a guy named Brigadier General Dyer. They block the only way out, and without a single word of warning, he orders his soldiers to open fire into the crowd. And they just kept firing for 10 straight minutes. Not until the threat was gone, but until they started running out of bullets. They fired 1,650 rounds directly into a trapped, unarmed crowd, killing hundreds of people. And when you hear General Dyer's justification, it's just bone-chilling. He said he wasn't just trying to break up a protest. He was trying to teach a lesson, to terrorize people so they'd never dare challenge British rule again. This wasn't about law. This was about brute force. And it was the complete bloody opposite of everything being preached in Paris. And this right here just lays it all out. It was a tale of two worlds. In Europe, you get self-determination. But if you live in a colony, nope, not for you. A proposal from Japan asking for a declaration of racial equality was shot down. And Germany's old colonies, they weren't set free. They were just handed over to the winners as protectorates. This hypocrisy sent a very clear message to the rest of the world. So this huge gap between the ideal and the real, between justice for some and domination for others, well, it was on full display in the most famous treaty of them all, the one dealing with Germany. Let's be clear, the Treaty of Versailles wasn't really about a just peace. It was about punishment. Germany wasn't even allowed at the negotiating table. They were basically just called in at the very end and told, here's the deal, sign it, or else.
So you have all this talk about building a stable Europe and making the world safe for democracy, right? But look at the actual terms. They had a war guilt clause that forced Germany to take all the blame for the war. They slammed them with reparations payments so massive they were designed to crush their economy. They dismantled their military. And the worst part? They forced all this on Germany's brand new, shaky democratic government, not the old empire that actually started the war.
So all these contradictions, justice for some but not for others, self-determination here but empire over there, this wasn't just hypocritical. It was like planting poison seeds. And they were about to sprout. You can just imagine the sense of betrayal. All over the world, people who had bought into the promise of a new, better world suddenly saw the truth. And this massive gap between the promises and the reality, it became the perfect recruiting tool for radical movements that hated the Western liberal order. And the backlash wasn't theoretical. It was immediate, and it was global. In India, a young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi sees what happened at Amritsar and shifts from asking for reform to demanding total independence. In China, students like a young Mao Zedong are so outraged that German-held lands are just handed to Japan that they turn away from Western ideas completely. And of course, in Germany, a failed artist and army corporal named Adolf Hitler finds the humiliating Versailles Treaty to be the perfect issue to rally people around and start his terrible rise to power. So it all comes back to this question, doesn't it? When our big idealistic promises crash into the messy reality of politics, who ends up paying the price? The Paris peace treaties are this incredible, tragic lesson. They show us that the gap between the world we say we want and the one we actually build, well, that gap can be a very dangerous place. It can plant the seeds for the next war and leave a legacy of conflict that, in many ways, we're still dealing with today.